Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Argument Clinic podcast. My name is Lawrence.
And I'm Martin Sigalo.
I don't know. That seems weird. Martin, you sound a little bit different today.
I'm sick.
You are sick, and as a result, your voice has risen like 3 octaves?
It's like 2.
Oh, okay. So, Martin, how was your summer?
My summer was okay.
You play a lot of
home.
Magic the Gathering?
I did. I played a lot of Magic the Gathering. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, and how did you do? Did you go to any tournaments?
Yeah.
And how'd you do at those?
Well, I did well.
You did well. Oh, okay. Can you tell me what your favorite deck in Magic the Gathering is that you figured out?
It's like picking between children. You can't ask me to pick a favorite child. I won't pick a favorite deck.
Oh, that's strange. I do that all the time. It's just pick a favorite child. Okay, so
you have children? Lawrence, congrats.
No, I was really referring to just, throughout the year, just the favorite ones.
You have more than one children? You have more than one child throughout the year?
No, because I should never bring children into this world. All right, so as you might have figured out, this is not Martin Siglo. Martin is actually studying for the LSAT like a good student, and so is...
I am! I'm a good student.
No, you're not. So unavailable to do this episode, and so we actually have a special guest, and her name is not Martin Siglo. It is, in fact, Pacy Yan. So, hi, Pacy. How are you doing?
Hi. I'm doing okay. I'm kind of tired. I'm getting ready to go off to college soon.
That is true. Where are you going?
I'm going to NYU.
Okay. And just tell us a little bit about yourself, like debate experience.
So I debated for Stuyvesant High School for 4 years. I did LD. I went to a bunch of tournaments, and I was captain my senior year.
Nice. And is there any particularly fond debate memory or favorite debate memory you have from high school?
Yeah, I really enjoyed going to camp when I was in high school, and I also just enjoyed like sort of joking around and hanging out with friends at tournaments and on my team.
Nice. So we are the Argument Clinic podcast, a Lincoln Douglas debate podcast for all, although as I heard at camp, apparently there are PFers that listen to us. So if you're in PF listening to this topic analysis, I don't know why, but there are certainly other episodes that you might be interested in listening to, like the ones about strategy or time management and stuff like that, all of which is applicable to non-LDers. But for the rest of you, I assume you're here to listen to our topic analysis episode. And so we are now back after our 3-4 month break. I actually have no idea how long we've been off the air, but we're back with a topic analysis episode. So over the summer, let's see, where have we been? I've been at camp for a long period of time. I was at 8 weeks of camp.
Me too.
And Pacy was also there. I actually led a lab with Pacy. That was fun? Question mark.
It was pretty fun.
Okay,
there's a picture of me kicking you on the camp Facebook.
She did kick me, not only in that picture, but also just generally in real life. And so we were actually working at the Victory Briefs Institute, which is also the sponsor of our podcast. So I just want to give a quick shout out and thanks to Victory Briefs for sponsoring the podcast by providing the equipment and hosting support. Victory Briefs is a summer debate institute and high quality brief provider. Learn more about their brief products and Victory Brief squads at victorybriefs.com. And much of the evidence and analysis that we'll be doing in this episode is based on the LD briefs, which were just released recently and are available at victorybriefs.com/publishing. So as I mentioned just a second ago, this is our topic analysis episode where we're going to talk about the September-October 2018 LD resolution. And so when we come back from this break, we're going to dive right in. All right, so the topic is resolved. In the United States, reporters ought to have the right to protect the identity of confidential sources. Pacy, you want to read that once for the listeners?
I'll read it?
Yeah.
Resolved.
You can.
In the United States, reporters ought to have the right to protect the identity of confidential sources.
Okay, so in this opening part, we're going to break apart all of the words in the resolution and address some interpretational issues and briefly touch on the sort of relevant background that you might need to know about this topic. And then in the next sections, we'll talk about AF arguments and then negative arguments. So the first thing I want to mention when we're talking about words in this resolution is there is no clearly defined actor in the resolution. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. The resolution itself does doesn't like say who ought to give the right, or like even who ought to establish this right, or not entirely even whether or not it's like a governmental policy or even a legal right or anything like that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Continue.
Yeah, so it becomes kind of very important to establish like what exactly it means to have reporters to ought to have this right.
Yeah, and so that I think is a big important question for anyone that is first taking a look at this topic, which is that most resolutions have a clear actor, but there's actually been a few recent ones that don't have a clear actor. I think the Nationals topic was that just basically the United States use of targeted killing in foreign countries is unjust. And it doesn't really, that one did not mandate an action. It mandated really just an evaluation about a states of affairs, right? Whether or not targeted killing was just or unjust. And I think this resolution is similar in the sense that it doesn't have a clear action that is being judged here because there's no actor really doing anything. It's just simply specifying in the United States. And so there are two possible ways of reading this resolution. Can you briefly discuss these?
Yeah, the first one is just to see the resolution as a sort of value judgment or as an analysis of what the state of affairs ought to be, e.g. that it would be nice if reporters ought to have the right to protect the identity of confidential sources, but not necessarily like obligating any one particular person or any one particular actor to act in a way that would give reporters this right. The second interpretation of the topic is that like in the United States implies like some USFG action or the federal government ought to guarantee this right or guarantee the legal right of reporters to protect the identity of confidential sources.
Right. And so I think I'm not heavily inclined either direction, but I would guess that the more accurate reading is the first one, which does not really mandate that any actor take any action, but really just as a question about whether or not it would be desirable if reporters had the right to protect the identity of confidential sources. I'm not sure what you think about this.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, especially because of like the rest of the wording of the resolution. So, for example, the plea bargaining topic from January and February said like plea bargaining ought to be abolished in the United States criminal justice system, which didn't necessarily like mandate an actor do it, but there are some words in the resolution that could imply that like the government were to do it. So, for example, in the United States criminal justice system, or abolished perhaps could imply that it ought to be some legal action, even if there's not an actor. But in this particular resolution, it's very unclear what it means to have a right in this instance, whether it's a legal right or just sort of a right that exists in the abstract, or reporters should have this option. It's very unclear.
Right, and this is actually the main focal point of Jake Nebel's like ridiculously long topic analysis in the briefs that I had the pleasure of looking through, which is just a lot of stuff about grammar and stuff. And I did not get through the whole thing before I fell asleep. So I actually don't know which way Jake concludes on this, but my understanding is that he's also sort of on the there doesn't have to be an actor. It's just a sort of desirable state of affairs. But I don't think it's wrong to insert an actor in here, because I think if you were to prove that the United States, like the United States as an actor, ought to guarantee the right to protect the identity of confidential sources for reporters, I think that would also affirm the resolution. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I also think it would definitely be heavily implied, especially under some frameworks, that would be what happens, or that would be the action that justifies doing it.
And so I think this this distinction between the two possible ways of looking at the resolution is important, not just from a grammar standpoint. So sorry, Jake, I don't I don't value the precision stuff as much as you do, perhaps, but because I think it has some implications for the sort of philosophical justifications that the affirmative might deploy to affirm the resolution. And so one thing that comes to mind is, before we jump into all of the AF and neg arguments specifically, one of the reasons for why the AF might forward for why reporters ought to have the right to protect the identity of confidential sources is something grounded in some specific obligation the United States government has. But that might not necessarily be applicable if the resolution isn't really questioning whether or not the government has this specific obligation. The affirmative might instead be compelled to defend just like some sort of general desirable reason for why that right ought to exist independent of any particular obligation that any government has. And so that's like one thing that I've noted. Do you think there are, other issues that might arise based on how you read the resolution?
Yeah, I think the opposite also applies sort of to affirmatives, because I think some debaters will make the argument that the affirmative is just a value judgment and not like some actual compelling reason for anyone to do anything. Well, maybe it's a compelling reason for someone to do something, but not like sort of something that says that someone has to do something, so much as like this would be nice to have, which they can make the argument that this takes them or like delinks them from like any negative arguments that are like it would be bad if the USFG were to guarantee this right, etc.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's the vast majority of that sort of dispute discussed, and I just encourage that debaters think about what they really mean when they're saying that they affirm this resolution. Are they really affirming that it'd be desirable for reporters to have this right, or are they saying that the United States has an obligation to guarantee this right? And I think that will change the way that debaters approach their philosophical justifications when they affirm. And I think this is something that is more elaborated upon in the topic analysis that was done at camp, which you can also view at the Victory Briefs YouTube channel. And it's going to cover a lot more of this technical resolutional wording stuff in more detail. Okay, so the next important question is reporters. And so first of all, broadly, what are reporters and who is a reporter?
I think what, especially judging by like the text of the resolution, our initial reactions of what reporters are just people who like work for media or work for news sources that collect information and then like report it to the original source or report it in some way to the general public.
Yeah, and so that seems to be basically what most dictionary definitions agree upon. So a reporter is a type of journalist that is particularly interested in gathering facts and then disseminating those facts or stories to the general public. And so two main features of the reporters are they have to collect information, and then the second key part is that they have to distribute that. So most people, I think, would just on face think, hey, it's these reporters at CNN or Fox News that are, standing in front of the camera reporting what's happening on the scene. But nowadays, it's the digital age. And so there's actually a lot of confusion as to who could be considered a reporter. Because it used to be that you had to be part of a sort of defined media company, right? You had to be someone that was on television, you had to be someone that was on the radio. But now there's tons of online-only news sites, and there's tons of journalists that we might call citizen journalists, and people who are not part of any established media group that are running around doing reporting. And so this, I think, raises a really interesting question, and one of which is when we say reporters ought to have the right to protect the identity of confidential sources, who counts as a reporter? And I think there's this question about what the affirmative is how the affirmative defines reporters, because I think that has a lot of implications for the arguments that the affirmative can get access to. So one thing I'm thinking of is if we define reporter very broadly, for instance, to include everyone like a citizen journalist, that would imply that virtually everyone has the right to protect the identity of confidential sources. And it could devolve into, I think, affirmatives defending very, very broad rights that may not be supported by philosophical justifications. But if we define it very narrowly, the reporters are just part of the old established media, like people who appear on television. That could be a problem because there's a lot of, bloggers or internet journalists out there or citizen journalists out there that might also want this right. And so there raises this question of, does the affirmative get to specify reporters? And so what are your thoughts on this, Pacy?
Yeah, I think both ways runs into a lot of problems. So if you were to define it very broadly, there's the issue of like now everyone's kind of a reporter and everyone could be a reporter, which might make the like affirmative much harder to defend. But if you're to define it narrowly, it becomes more questionable. So like some are like it begs the question of like what kind of news outlets or what kind of like television you consider something to be like an issue of reporting, and like whether or not citizen journalists count. I think the latter definition is usually the one that's like a better one, probably, because while it may exclude some parties, I think that one is better than just defining it broadly, which I think the only like conclusion that one would reach is like almost everyone is basically like a reporter, even like, for example, when someone like makes some comment on Twitter or like makes some blog to like place commentary on something, which I think makes it much harder to defend and probably much less logical.
Right. So I'm probably inclined to agree with you, but I don't have a strong opinion either way. And I think it's up to affirmative debaters to decide who counts as a reporter. Because I think the negative is going to have some serious objections about who counts as a reporter. If it's too narrow, there's certainly a class of arguments that the negative can bring up about why it being too narrow is problematic. And if it's too broad, then there's certainly another different set of arguments the negative can bring up, which we'll discuss later. But I think it's important that both affirmatives and negatives really consider what they think the definition of reporter is, and then be able to defend that view against an opposing one, and explain why their view is correct. Are there any other interesting questions concerning like the issues of reporters?
Yeah, I don't think so. I just think that while we know that reporters is obvious, like with the definition of reporter, obviously shapes what like affirmative ground there is or what affirmatives can or can't defend. I think that it's also very important to like realize that it also shapes like what negative ground counts as certain ground. So if like this is not clearly defined in the debate, it seems that a lot of the negative arguments could be irrelevant depending on what the affirmative defines as a reporter. So this is something debaters should like think about very carefully.
Agreed. There's a next question that concerns reporters, which is the affirmative justified in specifying a class of reporters that gets the right to protect the identity of confidential sources? So I'm inclined in most circuits to think no, because the resolution is broadly questioning specific rights or a specific right afforded to sort of all reporters, not to any particular reporter. So I'm inclined to think that they're not allowed to specify a group of reporters, like reporters for one media group or reporters that report on a certain type of thing. But what do you think about this?
I think that it's probably not super justified, but that there are like good reasons to think why people would. For example, like a particular piece of literature is interesting, or a particular thing is like particularly strategic. I do think it's probably not super justified because nothing in the resolution, grammatically speaking, seems to imply that you can specify a subset of reporters as opposed to just generically understanding it as all reporters in the United States.
All right, agreed. All right, so the next term is oct. I don't think there's much to be said here other than the fact that this sort of feeds into the first question that we posed, which is, what do we do given there's not an actor? And I think this oct phrase here helps explain, although very loosely, that we're really just referring to a desirable states of affair here. We're not using ought in the sense that there's a moral obligation for any particular person to carry out anything, but ought as in like it ought to be the case that X thing occurs, and we don't have to specify any particular actor to get to that conclusion. Okay, so the next term is right. So this one I think is kind of interesting. So what is a right? And yeah, what is a right broadly?
It's something that someone can do or is permissible, whether it's like morally or legally for that person to do that thing or utilize this thing.
Right, and so it's just some basic claim to something, some entitlement. So like some entitlement to freedom, some entitlement to, something offered by the government, like protection or something like that. And so we have this question of what is a right generally. And so I think we understand that there is a right, but the resolution is kind of interesting because it poses the question of the right, and it says the right to protect the identity of confidential sources. What does it mean to have the right to protect the identity of confidential sources?
It implies that it's something specific as opposed to just something that is like a right or just like permissible in some particular instance for them to do it, but it implies that they should generally have this right or something that they are capable of using.
Yeah, so I think it really just refers to something specific here, and I think this specific right is probably most commonly mentioned in the literature as reporter's privilege. So what do you know about reporter's privilege, and what does that mean?
Reporter's privilege just refers to the reporter's right, whether or not, reporter's privilege is when the reporter has the right to maintain the confidentiality of their sources in a court trial, e.g., the court cannot mandate that the reporter give away the name or identity of the confidential source that they got their information from.
Yeah, and so it's just basically the right not to testify about information received from confidential sources. And so the reporter's privilege is the one that I think is most frequently debated about in the literature, and the one that is most, that has the most arguments for and against it. And you might hear it also called like the journalist privilege, confidentiality, or shield laws, and we'll discuss each of those things in turn. But broadly speaking, it's just the right not to testify about information received from confidential sources. And here, we're referring specifically to the identity of those confidential sources. And so it's an interesting one, one that has, for one thing, it's not an absolute right because exceptions exist to the reporter's privilege, like attorney-client privilege, pleading the fifth, et cetera, to the general idea that we can compel witnesses to testify in court. And so we think generally witnesses have to be compelled to testify in court, but we recognize exceptions to them, such as the fact that you can't compel a man to testify against his wife. And so the reporter's privilege is probably just like another instance of one of those exceptions to the fact that witnesses usually are forced under oath to tell the truth. And this is a right that was established, well, not really established, but just debated about in this Supreme Court case called Brandsburg versus Hayes. What do you know about this court case?
Yeah, so Brandsburg v. Hayes was a SCOTUS or Supreme Court case that said that you can't use the First Amendment as a reporter in order to not, in order to...
You can do it, I believe in you.
What?
You can do it, I believe in you.
I'm going to start over.
Yeah.
Okay. Brandsburg v. Hayes was a 1972 SCOTUS or Supreme Court case that established that reporters cannot use the First Amendment as defense when they have to testify before a grand jury. This was a 5-4 decision that said that basically reporters' privilege in federal courts is not allowed to be used. While there are like shield laws within states, or states individually have like justified reporters' privilege in some way or the other, in federal courts under Brandsburg v. Hayes, it's established that reporters' privilege cannot be used.
Yeah, and so the confusing thing about this case is it's old, and it's the only time they've seriously considered the reporter's privilege at the sort of federal level. But all of these states have different shield laws with totally different degrees of scope and stringency. And so there have been a bunch of people attempting to get a federal shield law passed ever since that case, when it failed very narrowly on a 5-4 decision. And all the states seem to think that it's a thing, minus like what, Montana? Is that the only state that doesn't have reporters' privilege?
I don't know.
I think it's Montana. It's the only state that doesn't have it. And so most states have some qualified form of reporter's privilege. It's just not a federal one. And so I think really when the resolution is asking, we ought to guarantee the right to protect the identity of confidential sources, it's not referring to the fact that right now is good, because there are limited rights to protect the identity of confidential sources, but to like varying degrees across all the different states. So I think when they're saying the right, they're really referring to the federal government establishing some federal shield law or ruling on a First Amendment grounds or something like that, that there is in fact a right to protect the identity of confidential sources. And so really, I think the resolution is asking, would it be desirable if the United States had some federal shield law or federal protection where reporters have the right to protect the identity of confidential sources? At least that's what I kind of think when thinking about the phrase the right, because I think it's typically referring to a uniform federal right. Do you think this is correct, or do you disagree or something?
No, this seems correct. Like the right seems to imply some universal or like uniform action that like some universal actor would take, e.g. the government establishing it across all states as opposed to states doing it individually, which might be some form of a right, but not the right necessarily.
Okay, cool. So the next phrase is confidential sources. The thing that I think to note about confidential sources is typically they promise, or they ask the reporter to promise them, hey, can you not reveal my name should this ever come up in if the federal government wants this information. Do I, like, not only in a court, but if the government simply subpoenaed a journalist or was attempting to force a journalist or reporter to reveal the source of their identity, basically most of these sources are asking the reporter to promise them, don't give it up. And so one thing to notice here about confidential sources is that most of them are already operating under the expectation of confidentiality, because remember, most states have some shield law that protects these reporters and basically just allows these reporters to honor their promise to their sources who they pledged, hey, I'd like, to remain anonymous. If you can promise me that, I'll give you this information. And reporters typically say yes, and they'll agree to that. So they're really just creating a promise to them to be confidential. And the shield law is basically just protecting that promise. And so I think confidential sources are really just promised people who have agreed to remain anonymous for the purpose of revealing information. I don't think there's anything else that's interesting about confidential sources, unless you think there is.
I think there is. There's like one little note, is that in the resolution as of right now, it seems to imply that like the right goes to reporters, which might seem originally to be like reporters get to choose whether or not to keep certain sources confidential. But the fact that it says that reporters ought to have the right to protect the identity of confidential sources seems to imply maybe in some way that the sources themselves have established themselves to be confidential as opposed to just reporters establishing them, which also seems to beg the question as to whether or not reporters get to decide if they're confidential originally, or if it has to be the case that the sources themselves decided that they're confidential for the reporters to keep them confidential.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So just to quickly wrap up this, what do the words in the topic mean? I want to just take a step back and sort of think about what the journalist's or reporter's privilege really means as sort of in relation to other legal doctrine. So the thing is the law is always willing to grant an exception if they think that there's some strong reason for that exception being good for societal welfare. And they usually like to maintain these exceptions because they think it's necessary for the smooth functioning of societal relations. So, for example, there's doctor-patient confidentiality, where doctors, except in the most extreme of circumstances, are not capable or not legally able to give private medical information about a citizen over to the federal government because that is protecting their doctor-patient confidentiality. Similarly, there's a spousal exception where you're not compelled to testify against your spouse in court. And there's an exception for attorneys and clients where attorneys are, unless the person is literally plotting to murder someone with the attorney, attorneys are in fact required, not just allowed, but required to keep all the information that was revealed to them under attorney-client privilege away from the court. They can't give it up. And the rationale for almost all of these privileges is just because they think it's good for smooth function of society. So, for example, doctor-patient confidentiality. It's based under the rationale that if this confidentiality didn't exist, then patients would be deterred from revealing private medical information that would be really good for doctors to have. Or for spousal communication, the courts think that it'd be really good that marriages could be smooth and not full of distrust, where someone was always worried that whatever they said to their spouse could be used against them in court. And same with attorney-client privilege, that defense lawyers can't mount a vigorous defense and contribute to an adversarial justice system if there is no privilege that incentivizes people to reveal every bit of information that would be useful for the defense. And so to view the reporter's privilege isn't super strange if considered in context of all these other existing legal privileges that exist. And I think it's really helpful for debaters to think about these other privileges and the rationale for why they exist, and to think about the sort of basic underlying question that is being posed here, which is that is it sort of an open communication versus judicial access to privileged information, right? Is it better that we have sort of free-flowing communication between individual parties, such as journalists and their sources, doctors and patients, spouses and the attorney and client, et cetera, or is it better that we allow the government access to this information, whether or not they can have access to information that was revealed in a privileged sense? So I think that's question number one that debaters should consider when they're thinking about the topic. And then the second main issue is, once again, bringing up this issue of who in the world is a reporter. I just want to reiterate that this is a central question, not just for defining the resolution, but in terms of the legal doctrines that will be cited here, as well as the type of arguments that both the affirmative and the negative can get. That defining a journalist very narrowly seems to create problems under sort of a defining who a reporter is very narrowly seems to create very specific First Amendment exceptions for people, which is kind of bad. Or defining it very broadly or very widely means that literally anyone can use this privilege, and then it seems to make the privilege kind of useless. So I think that those are the sort of two core questions that debaters need to think about before we dive into affirmative and negative arguments. Do you have anything to add there, like another core question or thoughts about any of the things that I just said?
I agree.
All right, nice. I like it when we agree. Okay, so when we come back, we're going to discuss some affirmative arguments and then some negative arguments. All right, so now we're going to discuss some possible affirmative arguments on the topic. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce you to what the argument basically is. We'll discuss some good value criterions or frameworks that might go along with it, and then we'll discuss one or two possible negative responses to each individual argument. So let's start with the first one, and we grouped this one as sort of just chilling effect / whistleblowers. Can you explain the sort of basic idea behind this argument?
Yeah. So this argument is just that whistleblowers will be disincentivized to whistleblow or reveal corruption either in like corporations or in particular institutions if they know that the confidentiality of their identity is not safe. E.g., it might be revealed that they are the ones who gave these like companies or whatever away, and that they may face repercussions as a result. Which chills whistleblowing, and the argument is that is bad because now we can't find corruption, or whistleblowers are key to dismantling corruption or whatever.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. And so it creates a chilling effect where, and this is the word that's most important here, is that sources are deterred from coming forward to discuss most of the serious issues that they want to talk about because they fear prosecution from the government. And so the theory behind the chilling effect argument is that there is, because of the variance in state laws, where they don't know whether or not a federal shield law applies to them or not, they're not willing to come forward if they know that revealing the information that they are going to reveal might land them in a federal penitentiary. And so they are particularly concerned about prosecution, as well as the fact that there is legal indeterminacy because of the variance in state laws. And so you mentioned that this is a good argument or a good frame. So that's the basic idea of this argument. It's really easy to find. If you just Google reporter's privilege, basically all of the arguments for why we should have reporter's privilege is basically centered around this chilling effect whistleblower stuff. And so I don't want to get too much into it because it's really the core of the topic literature, and there's not much here in terms that we can offer that you can't just quickly read on your own. But I do want to discuss some debate-specific things, which are what are possible value criterions or frameworks to pair it with. So you mentioned one thing earlier about corruption, and can you talk about maybe why that is an impact that matters and what criterion we could pair it with?
I think corruption is one that falls under a lot of different frameworks. So it could definitely be sort of a generic big stick impact that falls under most util frameworks or frameworks that care about like the livelihood of society at large and arguments as to why corruption might harm that. I think it could also apply to, for example, structural violence as frameworks that talk about why corruption uniquely harms X minority group. But certainly I think it can also fall under a lot of other frameworks that talk about whether or not we should maintain equality for people, or we should any framework that says that everyone should be respected in X way, or that corruption is bad.
Yeah, and I agree with all of those. So just common utilitarian frameworks that care about structural violence, frameworks that care about sort of the value of checks and balances. There's one framework that was really popular at camp that paired really well with this contention, and it was called civic republicanism. Can you briefly describe what civic republicanism is?
Civic republicanism, from my understanding, is that it's a framework that is consequentialist and cares largely about non-domination. So the author that writes about this primarily is Pettit, and he talks about how people should be allowed to have honor within the society, and that the government should not dominate individuals, which is to say that freedom is good, but the way that Pettit characterizes freedom is slightly different from the way that many others or we might conventionally consider to be freedom. So we might understand freedom to be we can do whatever we want, but under Pettit, it's it's not so much just the freedom to do what we want to do, so much as the way that other actors or other people or individuals around us might affect us to do those things. So for example, if I were coerced into doing something that I want to do, Pettit would say that that is bad because that is a form of domination over me, even though I still wanted to do that original thing.
Yeah. And so if you want to learn more about civic republicanism, you can just Google republicanism, and it will show up on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And it's a really good article. I recommend reading it. I just want to clarify a few things. So the first is that non-domination is the sort of core of what Pettit's theory is. And so again, it's distinct from what we might typically consider libertarian freedom or freedom from force. But really, republicanism is much more interested in freedom from the potential for domination. So the idea here is that even if no one threatens me as of now, the problem is that the mere capacity of other people to change the way that I act itself is a violation of freedom. So one example that could be given is, say, for example, I know that Pacy has a lot of power over me because she's my boss, which is false. It's the other way around. But let's say that Pacy is, and that she is prone to anger management issues and like burst out in angry tantrums. So if I do something wrong or I do something that she dislikes, she will fire me. So it is not an issue that necessarily that she can fire me. But what the issue is that I'm going to have to radically change the way that I behave around Pacy because she has an arbitrary amount of power over me that she can use against me whenever I do something that she dislikes. And so really the core of Pettit's argument is when he considers something as non-domination, he considers it as independence from arbitrary power. And so the key part is there is arbitrary. It's not the problem that Pacy has the ability to fire me, but the issue that she can fire me for totally random reasons that cause me to live in a constant state of fear and alter my actual behavior just merely because I'm afraid of the way that Pacy might treat me should I mess up and do something incorrect in my job. And so that is what Pettit thinks is important here, which is that you have to live in a state of independence from arbitrary power. And so knowing this in mind, why would this be a good framework to pair with our contention about why we should increase the amount of whistleblowers or people that are revealing problematic things about corporations or the government?
Well, it would mean that the government or even like institutions or companies within society are not allowed to dominate others within that society. So the argument would just be that having corruption or forms of corruption that allow secrecy or allow different forms of domination over others within society would be bad, and the framework would justify that now we should allow whistleblowing to happen, or we should allow reporters or the media to have a form of to have rights or to have their own privacy to report whatever they want to.
Sure. Are there any other frameworks that are important or you think would pair particularly well with this whistleblowing or chilling effect contention?
I think that there is one argument that I have heard people at camp make, and that I believe there's literature for it, where that it also pairs well with the sort of virtue ethics-esque that people are reading. So the argument for whistleblowing under virtue ethics is that whistleblowing is a virtuous act or something that we should do because it allows individuals to sort of recognize the bad things that happen around them, and they act out of a desire for the public good or for the good of others, which is something that is virtuous to do.
Okay, yeah. And so all of these different frameworks that we've mentioned, so civic republicanism, virtue ethics, utilitarianism, any consequentialist theory, or structural violence, all of these I think pair very nicely with what I think is probably the sort of best core argument on the topic, which is that there are shield laws now, but they are very scattered, they're not very uniform, and a federal or sort of uniform shield law would reduce the chilling effect that affects whistleblowers. And we think whistleblowers are good because they do a bunch of different things under different frameworks. So maybe they check the government, maybe they're key to prevent non-domination, key to ensure non-domination. They are good for virtue ethics, et cetera, et cetera. So how might one respond to this argument? Do you have any arguments off the top of your head for why this argument, how we could approach this as the negative?
Yeah, so well, specifically to the virtue ethics esque argument that people are making, the argument I think maybe that one could make to sort of turn this argument would be that whistleblowing is good, but that does not mean that confidentiality is good, e.g. that the act of whistleblowing is still a good thing to do, but it is much better for one to do it when they can reveal their identity and they're fully willing to take the repercussions of the act that they did, e.g. whistleblow, after whistleblowing, because that proves that they had to choose between sort of their own selfish safety or whatever and the society at large or something or society at large, and they chose to whistleblow rather than just sort of keep to themselves and not whistleblow for themselves.
Okay, sure, that makes sense. I'll add a few more. So first, or additionally, you can obviously just respond to the truth or the falsity of the affirmative framework that they've selected. So not only can you say that virtue ethics is incorrect, but you could have some reasons for why. Civic republicanism is false, utilitarianism is false, checks and balances as a criterion is false, et cetera, et cetera. And these are, I think, good, solid core responses that you can have, given that the best affirmative arguments will be couched within a particular framework, which, if you disprove, will severely undercut the strength of the affirmative arguments. There's also a few general arguments that you can make. And I think the first one is that right now, there doesn't seem to be much of a chilling effect. And it doesn't really seem like it's really important to have, a federal shield law. So think of all of the big leaks that we've had in the last couple of decades. So start as early as Watergate, where a person who did not have the benefit of a federal shield law still revealed information about Watergate. Think about Snowden leaks. Think about the information that we learned about CIA torture sites. Think about all of these sort of things. And so these are all, I think, good empirical demonstrations that we don't need a strong federal law, given that currently there are people already revealing things that are embarrassing to the government and to corporations, for that matter, without a federal law, because they are not actually being chilled right down the status quo. And so this is, I think, a good general response to push in on the affirmative, which is that, look, the affirmative doesn't really do that much. It certainly isn't going to, make the government suddenly non-corrupt or anything like that, given that right now there is a lot of whistleblowing. There are a few more responses, but we'll discuss those as responses to some other affirmative arguments. So the next, well, actually, do you have any final thoughts about the chilling effect or whistleblowers argument?
Just sort of adding on to yours, I guess, is that negative should not forget that currently in the States there are certain qualified federal shield laws that exist. So it is almost very possible that the status quo would solve this argument on the affirmative. It's not like if we don't pass the affirmative, then no reporter's privilege in any form exists at all. So I think this could be a very strong negative argument to forward.
Agreed. Okay, so the next argument that you have listed here, because I made you fill out most of the outline, is democracy. And so I think there are two strands of arguments that are going to be listed under democracy. Can you discuss them?
So the first argument is whether or not the press, sort of having press independence, is a good thing, or discussions as to how the press is key to democracy. For example, the press is key to checking back or making sure that government officials or particular groups of people are held accountable, especially within positions of power, because the press being separate from those groups of people means that they are capable of reporting to the public anything that can happen, and that holds those individuals accountable. And that confidentiality is good because it's key to maintaining press independence. It's key to making sure that the press is able to continue checking back on those individuals.
Right, and so I think the first issue of democracy is whether or not the press is capable of performing its function as sort of the fourth estate, which is to remain separate from the government and to continuously check it. And there's, I think, another strand of argument that is really important on this issue of media independence that you mentioned, which is that we need to ensure that the media is, in fact, separate from the government. And there's this worry that right now there are a lot of subpoenas that are allowing investigators to basically offload their investigative requirements onto reporters, basically just having reporters do all the dirty work and gathering, information from sources that otherwise would not speak to the government, and they're basically just having them do all the dirty work, and they're just taking it from them. And there's this issue where it's now sort of blurring the line between the separation of the media and the government. And so I think there are two real serious concerns about this. First is that there's probably going to be a sort of general decrease in the trust of the independence of the media or the press. And so just similar to what Pacy mentioned a second ago, it's going to really impair the ability of the government or the media to serve as an adequate check on the government, and it's most importantly going to impair the public's perception of the media's ability to check the government. And the second, I think, other concern, although not as serious in my mind, is that it disadvantages smaller media sources without massive legal teams, which perhaps crowds out the media landscape. And so this might be a serious concern if you're worried about sort of basically making sure that only big news sources survive, and you think that there's a value in having an independent media that is separated from the established companies like CNN and the BBC, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think these are all serious, important concerns for democracy, given that democracy not only thrives when people have their input heard through formal processes like voting, but also have their voices expressed through independent outlets, most importantly, like the media. So I think those are my basic thoughts about democracy. Anything to add to that?
Not in particular.
All right, so frameworks then for democracy.
Frameworks for democracy?
Yeah, frameworks. What are some good ones?
So there are a lot of democracy good frameworks that exist. For example, like something that's like consistency with like democratic principles or whatever, I guess could work or generically apply to this kind of offense. I also think it could be paired with like some of like this civic republicanism stuff from before, because it talks about how the press is key to maintaining checks, or press independence would be good as a form of checking back against a non-domination.
Yeah, agreed. So just like any democracy framework or democracy good framework, you could even potentially draw on traditions in the social contract to explain for what the value of sort of democracy and an independent free press are. I don't think it's that very difficult to find those justifications. So potential responses to democracy. I'll take this one. So the first one is to question whether or not press independence would actually be solved by instituting a federal shield law. So one of the main issues in the modern age of electronics and the ability to spy on everyone basically is there's a question of whether or not instituting a federal shield law would stop the government from getting a hold of this information anyways, because they can probably get access to a lot of this information regardless of whether or not they have a shield law. And so there's a lot of people that have concerns that just like modern day surveillance means that they can just get the identity of these whistleblowers without having to subpoena them or without having the reporter testify on their behalf. And there's also issues, for example, of NSLs, which are national security letters, which can be used by the federal government to gain access to highly personal information, which is not checked by a testimonial privilege like the reporter's privilege. And so there's lots of reasons to doubt the effectiveness of instituting a federal shield law in preserving press independence and ensuring the greatness of the media. Second is all of the, I think, above arguments apply from the first point about chilling effect on whistleblowers. A lot of these arguments are very similar, so a lot of the arguments for why it doesn't work would also apply here as well. And finally, it's not exactly clear why there is a problem with having access to sort of information that might be important for, say, for example, national security. And so the negative could functionally contest the entire premise here of whether or not democracy does require a separation between the reporters and the government, if the negative is simply saying, yeah, but that information is in fact valuable for the government to have, and we should allow the government to get a hold of that information. And we'll discuss some of the reasons for why the negative might believe that when we talk about the negative arguments. Okay, so the final affirmative argument here is that of lib, or libertarianism. So I actually am not particularly familiar with what the libertarian argument on this topic is. So would you mind explaining it for me?
Well, I didn't hear this like particularly commonly read or the argument being made that often. But I believe, from what I've heard, the argument is that having the right to protect confidentiality is something that reporters ought to have, because that, by virtue of their sort of, I think the argument is somewhat twofold. It's like this is a freedom that they ought to have, because by virtue of being a reporter, they should have the right to sort of pick and choose whether or not they reveal certain information, because that's their job as a reporter. I believe the second argument is similar to like a promise-keeping argument that um, other other different affirmatives under different frameworks might also argue for, is that maintaining the promise between the source and the reporter themselves to maintain their confidentiality is a good thing.
Okay, those all sound reasonable to me. Obviously, libertarianism style arguments should get paired with a libertarian framework. So I don't think there's any need to really discuss that any further. And of course, you can just respond to this affirmative case by mentioning, hey, libertarianism seems incorrect. Let me list 100 reasons for why that is the case. As well as just sort of contesting the same arguments that we mentioned earlier. So all the things that I mentioned above concerning chilling effect and democracy, I think would also apply here to this libertarian style affirmative. I think those are the main AF arguments. Is there anything else that you think is worth briefly mentioning?
Yeah, I think this argument about how confidentiality is bad because it hinders some form of like truth, or whether or not certain sources will now just lie about the information, is, I think, a good response to a lot of these different affirmatives, because most of them rely on either A, information good, or B, some maybe like libertarian-esque argument that's like promises are good, or not lying to like individuals is good. But I think this argument could, I think, persuasively turn a lot of these affirmatives, because the argument would be that now like sources can just lie to like the general public, and that would be bad in either sort of a utilitarian-esque way, or as a form of domination, or even as a form of just like breaking promises, quote unquote, or just like not telling the truth.
Yeah, I agree. And so I think we'll discuss this a little bit more in the negative section, but you're correct. This is a very strong negative argument that is in fact going to have strong implications about the affirmative's ability to solve their impact, and in fact might turn it, as you mentioned. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Anything else here?
Nope.
All right, cool. So when we come back, we'll briefly discuss the negative arguments, and then we'll have our conclusion segment. All right, so now on to the negative arguments. So as Pacy and I were just discussing during our break, which, by the way, is more than 10 seconds long. We sat here and chatted for a while. We were mourning the is the proper word dearth here of negative arguments?
The lack of, the absence of this.
Yeah,
the tragedy that is negating on this topic.
That is what dearth means. Okay, so there are, however, a few, I think, core solid negative arguments that we can make. I'll start with the first one, which is that of crime. And this is, there's two different ways that we can phrase this crime argument, and I'll discuss them both. So the first is just sort of as a sort of philosophical concept here, that independent of whether or not it actually reduces crime, that a reporter's privilege subverts the fundamental function of the court system. Okay, so that establishing a reporter's privilege really undercuts the reason for why we have a court system, which is ultimately to sort of prosecute other people or individuals who have been accused of committing a crime or an offense against society, and to render a sort of decision that is impartial and fair that balances the need for retribution and deterrence. So broadly speaking, that is what most people would agree the purpose of the criminal justice system is. But a reporter's privilege would undermine that. Because it would be the case that if there was information that a reporter had that would be valuable for stopping a crime, that would not be required to be given up to the court. So the courts could not mandate that the reporter turn over the identity of a confidential source that could be necessary to ultimately prosecute other people for committing crimes. And so there's this really popular author on this topic. His name is, I think, Randall Eliason. He's professor in law at George Washington University. He writes a lot of stuff. He's been writing about reporter's privilege for many years. And he has this article entitled "Reporter's Privilege Would Allow Crimes to Go Unpunished." And so he's going to make the sort of less philosophical version of this argument, where he's not sort of talking about whether or not it empirically increases crime or prevents the courts from doing their job. He's going to talk about why he's more interested in the actual outcome of this, which is that independent of the philosophical argument for why courts have an obligation to prosecute those who've committed crimes, that there's in fact a sort of empirical reason to think that this would be the case. And so the basic point of Eliason's argument is that those who commit leaks, so the sources, the confidential sources who are providing information to the reporter, are committing a crime by leaking information. And so it is, he says, quote, "It's appropriate to punish the person who leaked the classified report, damaged national security, and put the American people at risk." And says that functionally, the reporter's privilege would make it impossible to get the identity of the person who leaked the information, because sometimes that's the only person that even knows the identity of the person who's leaking is the reporter. And so these are the two basic strands of this crime argument. So number one being that there's a sort of philosophical, less than consequentialist reason for why a reporter's privilege is problematic, which is that it subverts the primary function of the court and the criminal justice system in the first place. And the second is a sort of empirical argument that, in fact, it does allow crime to go unpunished. And there's reasons to think that that sets a bad precedent for other people to commit crimes in the future, which is also bad. And so that's the basic idea of here. And he also, even at the end of this article, says, hey, you know, if we think that they did a good thing by leaking this information, that seems to only imply that the good thing that we should, that seems to only imply that the solution is to fix the thing that they leaked information about. So rather than allowing reporters to commit crimes by leaking information, we should just fix the thing that they're talking about. So for example, if you leaked information about bad treatment practices at Guantanamo Bay, we should just fix bad treatment practices at Guantanamo Bay. And that, I think, is the sort of basic idea of the crime argument. And I'm not sure if there's anything else to say in terms of the substance of the argument. Does that seem to all make sense to you?
That seems to be the substance of the argument. I was thinking just about like frameworks or like framing arguments that one could tie it with these.
Yeah, so that is something that you're certainly better at than I am. So you want to go in and talk about those?
So in terms of like the more philosophical way of understanding this crime argument, or I think a lot of philosophical frameworks, not a lot of strong ones, because certainly justifies things like crime is intrinsically bad, or crime is inherently just like a function of evil or whatever. And those arguments that are like court systems good, or court systems are key to finding truth, or court systems are necessary for like justice, or any like sort of retributiveness, like good retributivism framework could apply, e.g. something like Kant or something like Hegel could certainly apply it in the way that like Lawrence has characterized this crime argument.
Yeah, and one other framework that I think we used in the demonstration debate at camp was communitarianism, which characterized crime as a sort of affront to the community. And communitarian's basic idea is that sort of we should care a lot about the community because we're not sort of isolated individuals, but rather part of a community where we get not only our identity, but also a lot of our moral norms from, and that crimes against the community are intrinsically bad and should be punished. And that's the purpose of a criminal justice system. Yeah, that's the big idea here about the crime argument. Are there any other frameworks that are worth mentioning?
I think that about covers it.
Yeah, okay, agreed. So affirmatives can respond to this crime argument in a few ways. First, they can simply say, who cares? As it turns out, the reporters are doing a good thing by breaking the law and leaking information about unjust corporate or government practices. And
not the reporters, the sources.
Oh, sorry, the sources are doing good thing, my bad. And that reporters are just doing their job, really speaking. So we can say the sources are allowed to do this because, as it turns out, you can draw from this sort of basic idea that an unjust law is no law at all, and simply say, hey, if there's an unjust law, you have some obligation to break the law to point out the problems with it on the source's part. And then reporter's privilege is necessary for for society writ large to understand what problems there were in the law to help fix it in the future. And so we can't say, for example, that this law was unjust if we never even knew that that law existed. And that might be only possible if we have a reporter's privilege. And that allows the reporter to get that information from someone who is in fact afraid of coming forward and speaking, and allows them to use that information to transform society into a more just society overall. So you could say, ultimately, who cares if they committed a crime? The whole purpose of it is really just to make crimes better in the future, lower crimes in the future, my bad, and to ultimately ensure that laws are more just in the future. And so there's a lot of philosophical debate about whether or not it is justified to break the law. And in the context of the whistleblowers debate, it's very robust literature base. And so I recommend really getting into this because I think this crime argument is like one of the core negative arguments. And I think there's lots of really good in-depth clash here. The second way that the affirmative can respond is by simply leveraging their framework against theirs. So whatever the negative says is important, the affirmative will simply say, nope, the other issue that I've raised is more important. So maybe the negative says communitarianism is true, and the affirmative might just be like, nope, utilitarianism. We only really care about well-being and happiness, and explain why the affirmative's framework is correct. But I'm much more interested in the first response, which is just like directly clashing with the basic idea of the crime argument, and having a debate about basically whistleblowing versus crime. And that is a very interesting and in-depth debate that I think debaters would be, they'd really benefit from reading a lot about this. Okay, any other thoughts about the crime argument?
No, agree.
Okay, next one, terror. So basic idea of this terrorism argument is that leaks are not only bad because they are a crime, but because leaks themselves are a national security risk. So the basic idea is that a reporter's privilege would incentivize individuals who had this information to come forward to reporters and leak information that might be damaging to national security, and to leak information that might benefit terrorists. And so the basic idea here is that there's going to be a ton of authors that are going to explain for why leaks from within the White House and leaks about counterterrorism policy are harmful to our counterterrorism operations against terrorism abroad and even domestically here at home. And so that leaking information is in fact basically a boon or a gift to the terrorists, and we should prevent that. And there's a bunch of different reasons for why leaking might be bad for our counterterrorism operations. So first is it might tip off to terrorists that we know what's going on. Second, that it might reveal our counterterrorism strategy, which might enable them to better adapt and hide from it. And third is it might weaken public support for counterterrorism operations, which erodes overall support of the program, which makes us less effective at combating terrorism writ large. But there's good reason to think that we keep classified information for a reason, and which is generally speaking because of national security, and that leaking that classified information damages our national security and thus increases the risks of terrorism. That's the basic idea of this argument. So I assume you're also interested in discussing some of the potential frameworks that this argument could fit underneath. So do you have any frameworks in mind?
Yeah, so the framework I think that I heard that some people were talking about and people were reading was like a sort of Hobbesian-esque framework that talks about how, well, I think this argument has a few potential routes you could go. I think the first one could be just some argument that's like the sovereign's will or the government's will should be, Hobbes is arguing with that. It should be a will above others, and it should be the one that society follows. Now, I think this would directly, I think, clash with a lot of arguments that are like press independence good, or reporters' privilege is key to maintaining that the press can check back against the government. Because obviously Hobbes would say, nope, that's bad because the government's will should come before others. And that means that, for example, things like press independence are bad because that's a way of like subverting the government's will, or subverting or using confidential sources to sort of privatize themselves away from the government and not be under sort of the government's surveillance or the government's control in some way.
Yeah, and of course, don't forget that we can always, of course, couple this with the utilitarian framework and just be like, hey, terrorism is bad under util.
Yeah. Also, I think under Hobbes, like some national security things would certainly obviously apply because they would say that the state of nature. Hobbes would say that the state of nature is terrible, and that things that affect national security are unique, cause states or the U.S. to be in uniquely vulnerable positions that would allow us to come closer to the state of nature or whatever, and that national government, federal government control over information, or the way that reporters and sources leak their or process, create, spread, etc. information affects the way that national security functions, and that the government should have control over it.
Yeah, all makes sense to me. So a few possible responses to this terrorism argument. So first and obviously, you could just be like, terrorism is not a real threat, and there's tons of empirical literature to explain for why caring about terrorism is not at all really important. And I won't go too much into this, but there's tons. If you type in literally "terrorism is not a threat," there's like a million articles for why terrorism is in fact an overhyped threat that doesn't really merit as much concern as we're giving it in the status quo. Second, you could simply say that counterterrorism is bad. And there's lots of reasons to think for why continuing our counterterrorism operations is in fact problematic. So just a few reasons off the top of our head. One is it has required the violation of many civil liberties in order to pursue our counterterrorism objectives. So for example, Snowden's reveal of the NSA wiretapping program, which violates a lot of our civil liberties, seems bad. Second, the counterterrorism effort continues a legacy of profiling and discrimination, particularly against Muslim Americans, which seems problematic. Third, and finally, is it tends to make us, very marginally safer at the expense of literally trillions of dollars and thousands of lost lives over, war, counterterrorism efforts in the form of, direct military involvement. So there's lots of different reasons to think that it's in fact a good thing that we are hampering some of the effectiveness of our counterterrorism operations, given that we dislike our counterterrorism operations so much. Finally, is the affirmative can question whether or not, in fact, the affirmative is going to make counterterrorism operations any worse. So as we mentioned on the affirmative side of things, when we were talking about responding to affirmative whistleblowing arguments as the negative made the argument, hey, well, people are revealing stuff now because there are, in fact, leaks such as Snowden leaking about the NSA, which means that the affirmative doesn't do much in terms of increasing the amount of people who reveal. Well, this terror thing is really just the opposite side of things. The affirmative can come right back and say, hey, the affirmative isn't going to get that many more people to leak, at least not high-profile classified information. That stuff's going to get leaked anyways, because if it's serious enough, people are going to come out and speak about it, which is why Snowden was the thing. And so really the affirmative is not going to increase the amount of national security leaks by that much. It's really just going to increase lower level leaks. So leaks, for example, about minor corruption scandals in the government, not the big ones, which are going to happen most likely anyways, if they're even if there isn't a federal shield law. All right, so I think those are most of my thoughts about the terror argument. Are there any last things to say about that?
Nope, I agree.
All right. Next argument, and don't worry, there are only two more here, is fake news. So I actually am not super familiar with this argument, even though I did find evidence on it. What do you know about this sort of fake news argument?
Originally when I heard this argument, I was like, this is not particularly a good argument. But this argument, I think, has a lot of potential. So I think this is also combined with the argument I was talking about towards the end of the affirmative section of this podcast, where how it talks about how confidential sources, if are guaranteed their confidentiality, will now just lie about information that they have, and more people are incentivized to lie, knowing now that they will be protected and that there's no repercussions to them lying about this information. I think this argument has a lot of potential different routes. So the one that I think is particularly persuasive is any argument that would warrant why telling the truth about information might be good. So arguments as to why spreading fake information could endanger national security. It could endanger the lives of people that live in the country in small or big ways. Or arguments that are just philosophically truth good, or knowing things truly is a good thing to be, e.g. stuff that's we should pursue the truth or find the truth. Any argument that would justify why lying, or arguments that would justify why having false information would be bad, would fall under this category of argument.
Yeah, That seems about correct. I think the most common card that was read at camp was this Wasserman evidence in this article entitled A Critique of Source Confidentiality. And the basic point of this article was just that secrecy hinders accountability because no one else can check the reporter over any inaccuracies, indiscretions, or, as you mentioned, just outright lies. And that seems to be problematic. And so, like, one good way to sort of conceptualize this in real life is just when the media says anonymous sources report, how many of you trust the anonymous sources, right? It's very difficult to know because you don't know who the anonymous sources are. You don't know if they're correct, if they're lying, if they're like anonymous sources, within the government, or anonymous sources in that they are, conspiracy theorists living in their mother's basement. You don't know who these people are. And so it potentially contributes to a lot of fake news, where if we establish a federal shield law, that all that's going to do is incentivize people to give inaccurate information, knowing full well that they can never be held accountable for that information that they give. And as Pacy mentioned earlier, a lot of those frameworks that she mentioned, like, things caring about the truth being good and stuff like that, are in fact really strong. But more importantly, is this really interacts well with the argument that we concluded the app section with, which is that, in fact, one major problem for the affirmative is that if it increases fake news, that is going to undermine the ability of any of the app's impacts to come true. So maybe chilling effects are bad in general, and we should have more whistleblowing because we can check the government. But if most of that information that's coming out is now false, that's not going to do anything to help check the government, and in fact might make it harder to check the government. Or maybe we think that press independence is good because it preserves the value of a free press that the public can trust. But if the public doesn't trust the press because it's all a bunch of anonymous sources that can't be verified and have no accountability, then no one's going to trust them anyways. So this fake news argument, I think, is, truly and honestly, the sort of core clash of the topic. The thing that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, which is that one of the core questions is whether or not there's a sort of, right to know versus a right to privileged information. And one of those issues is that if there is a right to privileged information, that might in fact incentivize people to provide very bad privileged information. And so I think this fake news argument is like very, very core to the topic because whether or not confidentiality increases or decreases the reliability and the accuracy of information is a strong question, not only in an empirical sense, but also just like in a philosophical sense. Because one of the most core primary justifications for why confidentiality is good, for example, the attorney-client privilege, the doctor-patient confidentiality stuff, all of that stuff is based on the idea that it increases quality information. But if that's not true, then it really undermines any basis the app has for this argument. Okay, I think that's my rant over. Is there anything else here?
Yeah, I think that one response that people like philosophically have made to this argument, not necessarily in like a utilitarian sense, is like, if like it's that the neg argument would be truth good, and that confidential sources, there's no way to know the quality of the information that you're getting because we don't know where it's coming from, and B, people can lie, like this truth good argument. I think that some affirmatives would make the response that it's like, but information good, in the sense that if they're not confidential, then people just won't give information at all, which means less information, which might, I think, potentially, like at least intuitively, turn this truth argument, because it's harder to pursue truth once we know less information. But I think that this response can be potentially good to this truth good argument. I do think this is an interesting debate to be had, but that those who are in the negative, their argument could just be that the comparison is between knowing false information or knowing information that is potentially false and not knowing enough about the qualifications of this information versus not knowing the information at all. I think they might argue that not knowing the information at all is better than knowing false information and having to work with information that you don't know enough about.
Agreed. I was actually about to move on, and I forgot that we didn't make an objection, so thanks for catching me on that.
Yeah.
Is there? Yeah, so obviously I think most of the debate is going to come down, a bulk of it, to just being like, hey, it's not empirically the case that it actually increases false information, or the affirmative is going to have to defend themselves using non-utilitarian style arguments. There's this article that does it. I think the author's like Eric Ugland or something like that, where they make the case for source confidentiality on non-consequentialist grounds or non-utilitarian grounds that avoids this objection mattering as much. Yeah. Okay, final negative argument. So this is the thing that I was mentioning earlier in the top, which is who is a reporter? And we concluded that this was like a serious issue that that the affirmative and the negative had to really think about. And not only just because it affects some of the affirmative's arguments, but I think most importantly is it affects negative arguments. And so there's really two possible routes to the affirmative, or actually three possible routes they can take in defining a reporter. They can either define it A, very narrowly to include just people inside of traditional news sources. B, they can define it very broadly, which is to include basically anyone who takes information and then disseminates it to the public on any medium whatsoever. So anything from cable TV to radio to now the internet. Or C, they can arbitrarily draw some distinction as to this person counts as a journalist and this person does not. So I think C is obviously probably the worst of both worlds, because there's no real authors that are going to defend some really particularly arbitrary line that's like, this person is a journalist, but this person is not. I mean, if you can find someone that defends that, sure, I guess. So most people are really going to be stuck between options A or B, so to define it broadly or to define it narrowly. And there's good reasons to think that both of these approaches are bad. So this is going to be the view articulated by Ronald Jones in their article, Rethinking Reporters' Privilege. And the basic point that is here is that either way you go about it raises some serious issues. So let's take the narrow interpretation, where it's only established news sources, which is a definition that worked fine prior to the advent of bloggers, citizen journalists, the internet, et cetera, et cetera. But now it's going to be really problematic because on First Amendment grounds, it's going to start creating classifications of people who have different rights than other people. And basic constitutional principles and really respect for basic equality of rights is going to dictate that we avoid differentiating between categories of speakers, particularly on relatively arbitrary bases, like what makes someone a reporter, and what makes something an established media company. Those are like very unclear questions. And so creating categories of rights for categories of people is not only problematic from a constitutional standpoint, but also bad from a just simply equality one, where we're now guaranteeing rights to particular people. And that's actually going to have harmful consequences for smaller media outlets. So a lot of media outlets exist solely online, and they don't have a particularly, they're not established in the way that, for example, CNN is or NBC is. And that might shut them out of the market, because now who in the world would go to a smaller media source if they know that they can't afford them the right to reporter's privilege, right? If they don't have reporter's privilege. And so that's going to create harmful problems for both constitutional, equality, and just pragmatic reasons, which is that now we're basically turning all of the power over to giant solidified media corporations, which is basically the whole reason why we have citizen journalists in the first place, which is to counteract the view that is typically forwarded by the larger establishment media. And so any reason you think citizen journalists are good is going to be a reason for why you think the first definition or the narrow definition of a reporter is incorrect. But let's say you adopt proposal B, which is to take a pretty wide-ranging view of or broad definition of who counts as a reporter. And this itself raises some problems, because if literally everyone counts as a reporter, then there's almost no way that the court system could possibly function, right? If every single person was capable of claiming reporter's privilege and be like, yep, I don't have to give my sources, the court system could literally never get information from anyone, because every single person would just be like, yes, I blog, therefore I'm a reporter, and now I don't have to give you any information that might be necessary for the court system to function. And so this pairs very well with the argument about crime and terrorism, particularly the crime argument, especially in a philosophical sense, which is that it really is going to undermine the possibility of the courts ever doing anything to fulfill its function of enforcing criminal law, because everyone is just going to refuse to give up information that might make them look guilty or a party that they know look guilty, because everyone can be a reporter. And so it doesn't really seem to matter how you define it, either narrowly or broadly. There are going to be some strong reasons to think that defining a reporter, however the affirmative defines it, raises some serious challenges. And this is, I think, also one of the most important pieces of negative ground. And in fact, it is listed in many of the court cases that are debating reporter's privilege as sort of like the one question that like no one can answer, because everyone's like, yeah, I think this is what a journalist is, but someone else will disagree. And there's no way to overcome this disagreement, because there's lots of reasons to think that each definition is bad. And equally good reasons to prefer every other definition. So there's no perfect solution, and each of them seems to have their own problems. So I think this could be a core set of negative arguments, which is to indict either a narrow, broad, or arbitrary definition of what a journalist is. That's my thought on that argument. Are there any frameworks that you think would go well with this, or just like any of the other ones that we mentioned above would also do fine?
Yep.
All right, works for me. For the affirmative, this is simply, I think, a matter of you picking a definition and having good reasons why it's correct. So you can just bite the bullet and accept one of the things that the negative has said. So either you define it narrowly, broadly, or arbitrarily, and just defend that definition of reporter. And a lot of the proposals, for example, like articles that are like the need for federal shield law or something like that, a lot of them will have definitions of journalists in them, and you just have to be able to defend that definition to beat back these attacks. Okay, so I think that's everything on the negative side of things. Are there any other last-minute neg thoughts you have?
Other
than the fact that it's
so.
like sad to be negative.
It is sad.
Yeah. Oh well, I still think it's a good topic, and of the available negative arguments, I think the literature for them is deep enough that you're not going to run out. I think you'll be fine by and large. All right, so when we come back, we're going to have our conclusion and maybe a mini debate. We'll see. All right, so that is our episode for this week. We're really glad that we had the Pacy Yan come on. So thanks very much for coming on this episode.
Yay. Thanks for having me.
The enthusiasm can be felt from hundreds of miles away. In case you didn't know, Pacy is going to college at NYU, and she lives in New York. I live in Oklahoma, so we're hundreds of miles away from each other, despite the fact that I saw her just last weekend, which is sad.
I'm not currently at college, but
you are in New York.
Live in New York City. So
yes,
I'm so far away.
So if anyone wants to stalk Pacy, you know where she lives, in the largest metropolitan area in the United States.
It's really difficult to stalk someone. Okay.
Yes, it is sad. I can't believe it's only been like a week since camp. That's so sad. Anyways.
It feels like it's so long. I miss camp.
Well, yeah. Also, I had class for 12 hours today. I started at 9 a.m. and finished at approximately 9 p.m., although my class did get out a little bit early. And so that made it feel like camp was literally years ago, because I felt like today started a year ago.
Haha, I don't have a single class that starts at 9 a.m.
Well, I do want to point out, though, that I'm done for the weekend. I do not have class again until Tuesday at 9 a.m. So I have a 4-day weekend. So
okay, that's pretty good.
Yeah. It's so I can go to
I'm
more
jealous.
debate tournaments.
I want no Friday classes.
It's pretty nice. I've been having no Friday class for the last couple of years. Pretty awesome. Anyways, we are the Argument Clinic podcast. As we mentioned, a Lincoln Douglas debate podcast for all. Please listen to our other episodes, which you can find on SoundCloud or iTunes. Just simply search up the Argument Clinic podcast. Please tell your friends about the podcast. We're really just here to help improve the quality of Lincoln Douglas debate, particularly in places that don't have access to large programs. And whether or not you're like a seasoned veteran or just getting into this game or whatever, there is always more people that could benefit from our podcast. And we rely really heavily on you just telling your friends about our podcast. We don't make anything from this. In fact, I lose money every time I do this podcast. I'm really just doing it because I'm hoping that we can help more people. And the only way that can happen is if you tell your friends about these episodes. And one other thing you can do to help us is just review us on iTunes. Just leave us, some comments and feedback. And as always, if you have comments, suggestions, feedback, want to make comments about, Pacy Yan's voice or my, personality or lack of it, remember you can always email the Argument Clinic podcast at gmail.com. Also, for this episode, there will be some resources linked in the description, particularly a link to the topic analysis that was done at the LA2 session of Victory Briefs, as well as a link to some of the demonstration cases that were used in these debates. And I'll drop a link to everything that we mentioned in this episode down in the description. So last thing is there any sort of last minute advice for people that are, coming in? This is a new season, new topic. What do you got for these kids, Pacy?
In terms of like the topic or just like general debate advice?
Whatever you want. Just, a few minutes of unfiltered Pacy truth and advice.
Whoa. Okay. So I had this talk recently with a few people, I believe. But I think especially, I don't know, maybe it's just like the people I associate with, but it seems like a lot of my friends who are still in high school are now just stressed debaters or people who are like very stressed about this coming season.
That is true.
And I think like no matter what age, even like if it's like they're like rising seniors or they're like rising like sophomores or like whatever, they're all just like very stressed. I think there are a lot of very good reasons not to be stressed, and that people should care simultaneously. Like, it's not to say care less about debate, but so much as like think about debate in the big picture, not the specifics or the individual rounds. Just be happy, because you don't do debate to be stressed, and you don't do debate because it's like something that you like want to be stressed over, because stress isn't fun. You do debate because it's fun. You do debate because you learn things. You do debate because of the friends and connections that you make, not because you just want to be stressed all the time at tournaments and sad. Also, being excessively stressed is like actually counterproductive, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where every time you face some like fallback or you face some like stone in your path, you're just like, yep, proves that I'm a failure. Or maybe just proves that like also like stress is bad because it makes you do qualitatively worse at the thing you're stressed about, so it's counterproductive. And that's my little rant. Stop being stressed. Enjoy debate more.
I do agree with that. Stop being stressed. I really don't understand why people are particularly stressed over debate. School, I understand that has like a real impact on your life. Debate, it's just a fun thing that we do to like learn something, play a game, meet friends, stuff like that.
I understand why. It's not to say I don't understand why people were stressed about debate, because obviously I was very stressed about debate.
That is correct.
Which Lawrence obviously knows nothing about, because I definitely never spoke to Lawrence as a debater. But I understand why they're stressed, but I'm just saying that people should be less stressed or less oriented towards stress. They should be more oriented towards like, I want to do well, but I can always just sort of move forward from not doing well. It's like not that huge a deal. And debate is still fun. Yay.
Right. That is fair. My advice for those going into this tournament season is really just have fun, learn something, make sure that you're walking out of each debate learning something, even if it's just like, I could be better, but hopefully more concrete than that. Like, I could have spoken better, or I could have understood this issue better, something like that. And just treat each debate like a learning experience, but don't take it too seriously. You're here to learn and have fun. Losing a debate is not going to be the end of the world. And the last piece of advice I have is really just take the opportunity to like learn from other people. And so there's going to be two ways that I think you can do this upcoming season. The first is obviously to learn from your coaches, your elders, your opponents, your judges, take their advice and their feedback and learn from them. And the second way to learn is, I think, to instruct others and to help them. So if you know something about this topic, one really good way to approach the new season is to treat yourself as a teacher of sorts and to help teach others, because teaching is one of the best ways to learn. And I know this after a few years of coaching debate. And I think Pacy probably picked up on this lesson during camp as well.
You're old.
Thanks. And so, just make sure to take advantage of the people around you. Debate does not survive by individual effort alone. It's a group effort, which you should participate in by both learning from other people and teaching other people, which also helps you learn.
Wait, I have one more piece of advice.
Ooh, nice. What is it?
Okay, so I feel like at this point in my life, it would be out of character for me to not give this piece of advice, so I'm going to give it. I encourage everybody to just bring a stuffed animal.
Oh, dang it. I need...
Yeah, no, everyone just should bring stuffed animals to tournaments and to like everywhere they go, because stuffed animals are the best, and you can hug them and they make you feel better, and they'll unconditionally love you.
I will disagree with that last piece of advice, but I understand why other people might follow.
Wait, what is wrong with stuffed animals? Like,
they take up a lot of luggage space, and
not if they're small. They can go in your backpack.
Well, my backpack is for my technology.
Yeah, that's because you're a nerd.
Correct.
But stuffed animals are good.
Once again, thanks to Victory Briefs for sponsoring this podcast. Make sure to check them out at victorybriefs.com. Martin, usually wants us to do a mini debate.
I'm Martin.
You are not Martin. You are Pacy. But since he's not here, and since I am tired, I don't feel like doing a mini debate. So our mini debate is, should we have a mini debate? I'm going to take the side of no. I think Pacy's going to concede and agree to me, and I think we'll call it a day. unless you don't concede.
Yeah, I would suggest that we have a mini debate about whether or not we should have a mini debate, but I think we both agree that we should have a mini debate.
Good. We're both on the side of no. So
Sorry, Martin.
don't worry, Martin will be back for the next episode. So in case you didn't like Pacy, which I don't know why you wouldn't. She carries around stuffed animals, for goodness sakes. We'll be back soon. If you have suggestions for episodes, remember email us at theargumentclinicpodcast.com. And just once again to satisfy Martin, stay frosty.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.